Hello and welcome to this IFG discussion on the recently announced Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. The merger of the Foreign Office and the Department for International Development is one of the biggest shake-ups to how the UK runs its foreign and development policy in years. And while the Prime Minister's announcement of the merger in June took a lot of us by surprise, the fact of it was not necessarily unexpected. We've known that the Prime Minister has been interested in this since he was Foreign Secretary, if not before. The new department officially comes into being in September, but the Foreign Office and DfID have already been working together very closely for some time. They have a joint team of junior ministers, and we saw the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, or the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Secretary, as he'll soon be called, announce a reduction of aid spending of nearly £3 billion this year, which reflects the likely reduction in GDP resulting from the coronavirus pandemic. So clearly, the FCDO is already starting to come into being. As it takes shape, we want to consider what it should focus on and how it can be a success. And we have a great panel to discuss all of these questions and more. I'm joined by Sarah Champion MP, Labour MP for Rotherham and Chair of the International Development Committee, which published a report on the merger just a couple of weeks ago. James Cowan, CBE, who is the CEO of the Halo Trust, an NGO which works in countries recovering from conflict on landmine clearance and managing weapons and ammunition. And prior to joining Halo, James was a soldier serving in Kosovo, Afghanistan and Iraq, amongst other places, and as a Major General, he commanded the 3rd Division. And then finally, Lord Kerr of Kinlochard, a crossbench peer who was permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office and who during his diplomatic career served as Ambassador to Washington and permanent representative to the EU, amongst other roles. So thank you all very much for joining me. Sarah, can I start with you? You've been critical of the decision to merge the Foreign Office and DfID, but do you think this moment presents any opportunities for how the UK conducts aid and foreign policy?
Of course there are opportunities, and I want to start by saying that it's entirely the gift of the Prime Minister how he arranges his government. I think, as you alluded to in the opening, it was a surprise that it happened now. I have to say the timing as the Global South is entering the pandemic, and in June we were in the depths of it, I find really unfathomable. Not least because the staff both in the FCO and DfID were absolutely at capacity trying to deal with this. And as everyone knows, a merger takes an awful lot of resources and also headspace. But what also floored me was the lack of consultation and the lack of due process. The government had rightly started the integrated review, which it had paused because of COVID-19. And that was looking at sort of the 3 departments of defence, development and foreign affairs to look at how they could work together in a much more effective manner. So I recognise that, that there are problems that need to be addressed. That was paused, and then suddenly the merger happened without the evidence base for it. I am very concerned at the disruption this is going to cause. I'm very concerned at the expense this is going to cause. I'm very concerned about how it positions us internationally, because we were very highly regarded because of our development work. And also, whilst again, I can see positives in sort of a joined up process, removing the silo culture which can exist, removing the conflicts, the examples cited by the Prime Minister as good reasons, basically creating a buffer of countries between us and Russia and taking money away from Africa, which isn't my understanding of development and humanitarian aid and joined up thinking. So I'm an optimist, so I want to see positives, and in the long term they may well be. But at this point in time, I'm afraid I'm sceptical about what those benefits are going to be.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. That's a great start to the discussion. So, Lord Kerr, if I can turn to you, John, if I may. During your career in the Foreign Office, you saw various mergers and demergers of departments. Did what Sarah said about the sort of, the distraction and the kind of impact on the capacity of staff in the departments, did that echo with your experience of being in a department going through this kind of change?
Yeah, absolutely. I worked for DfID in the field when it was first set up as ODM with a very good Secretary of State, Judith Hart. There were some teething troubles then, and I saw the demerger with Claire Short running ODM, another very good minister. But again, there was a year, 18 months of distraction. Professor Hazel of UCL's Constitution Unit, the great expert on all these things, said in today's Times, the merger of larger departments is hugely distracting and time-consuming because of all the differences in terms of pay, conditions, IT systems, etc. Past experience in Whitehall shows that a merger means senior officials do little else for 12 to 18 months, in which context it's a pity that Simon McDonald and Secretary for Foreign Office is stepping down. I think this is particularly true of this merger, the merger of DfID and the Foreign Office, because the Foreign Office is staffed basically by the Diplomatic Service, which is a separate service, which has completely different conditions of service. Doesn't work to the Cabinet Secretary, it works to Simon McDonald. It has, for example, a requirement that members of the diplomatic service should be UK nationals. Because of its remarkable reputation, DfID has been able to attract really good people from across the world to work in DfID. Merging that, an international staff, with a staff which, for good security reasons, has to be UK national, is going to take a long time. I'm also very uneasy, like Sarah, about the motivation for this. I mean, it's very good that Mr. Johnson has said that we will stick to our commitments of the 0.7% GNI target. But the presentation with that terrible stuff about the comparison between aid to the Balkans and aid to East Africa, and the implicit criticism that we should be doing less in East Africa in order to do more in the Balkans, it suggests he doesn't really get the primacy of the poverty reduction target, which is central to the aid program, and should be. And the great catch point in the sky soundbite was a disgraceful slur on a highly professional department, which has a remarkable reputation around the world. Now, there are potential upsides to this merger, and they come back to that in a moment. But I'm with Sarah. I think the cons exceed the pros.
Thank you very much. Another great introduction to some of the issues that I hope we can unpack in more detail over the next hour or so. James, finally, to begin with, your organisation works with both departments, I believe, and you yourself have experience of working with both of them overseas. And I think you're a bit more positive, perhaps, than our other two panellists as to the opportunities from this merger. What are your hopes for the new department?
So thanks, Tim. I think that it's important in life to distinguish between things you can influence and things you can't. And it seems to me this is a decision that's been taken. I agree there wasn't much notice given and the consultation didn't happen, but it was announced and it is going to happen. And as Sarah rightly says, it's the right of any democratically elected government to arrange its ministers as it wants. I think we should focus less on the inputs and more on the outputs. And what is it that we're seeking to achieve here? I think that in the last 20 years, 3 events have happened that have shaped our world. The first was 9/11. The second was the financial crash. And the third is COVID. And the first event heralded a decade of intervention. And the second event heralded a decade of non-intervention. What I hope is that we can begin to think about how we position ourselves in this very, very difficult world post-COVID, in which perhaps a second Cold War is looming with China. And we think about the opportunities within the new ministry to place Britain where it should be, given its size, given its position, and given its interests. And so that what we do in the world is shaped by that very, very serious event that's recently taken place. Great.
Thank you. And I would love to come on to some of those sort of really timely things shortly. But if we can kick off the discussion by talking a bit more about sort of the big picture. So I think one argument for the merger that the Prime Minister advanced and others have sort of supported is that it allows development and diplomacy to work hand in hand. And hopefully, I think, the argument is that it would sort of avoid, 2 different parts of the UK government speaking out different sides of the mouth. So are there areas currently where the 2 departments' priorities differ or perhaps even are in conflict? And can a new department reconcile those differences? Sarah, I don't know if you have particular thoughts from your time on the committee.
I don't have a specific example, but I would like to use the example that James gave of a terrorist attack and looking at the extremism that's going on across Africa that is actually being fueled by people having hunger, loss of opportunity, and unstable governments, which is all being exacerbated by COVID-19. We know that the recruitment is going on, and one of the things that I would like to see going forwards is that when we're looking to deal with terrorism, you've also got the humanitarian developmental voice at the table, which has an equal weight. Because if you just focus on it from a defence point of view, my concern is that you either miss or you don't adequately deal with those underlying humanitarian issues, like having a hungry child or someone exploiting the instabilities that I don't know, a pandemic is causing. And that's my concern. At the moment, we have those two voices which may well be opposing, but I think that leads us to having a good decision-making process happening. And there seems to be no wish to have development sitting within the cabinet. My concern is that there isn't going to be an accounting officer. So where the money is going on the ODA spend isn't specifically being focused on. And I would really want there to be a senior civil servant as well as a political, whether it's a Secretary of State equivalent or senior minister, putting that development argument forward, because that's how we will work best together. And examples of that happen in this country with homelessness, for example. There will be a task force where the different departments all come together, work out a common strategy which complements each other to reach the objective. So I just hope going forward that DfID and those skills aren't completely subsumed, and that they are respected and that they are consulted. Yeah,
absolutely. And so, Lord Kerr, I don't know if you have a sense from your time in the Foreign Office or since then, but obviously one of the more recent innovations is the National Security Council, which David Cameron set up at the start of the coalition with Prime Minister's National Security Advisor. Shouldn't that be the kind of forum that can make these trade-offs, set these strategies, as Sarah mentioned, and then sort of parcel it out to departments? And do you think this role will sort of see a dilution of the role of the NSC, perhaps? This new department will see a dilution of the role of the NSC?
Well, I hope not, though I think the NSC will have to concentrate primarily on its security role, and that will be quite difficult for David Frost, who doesn't have a security background. But my feeling is that it all depends on the government's motivation. The reason why Claire Short was a very successful development minister was not really because the department was separate from the Foreign Office. It was because she had the real backing of Gordon Brown, who was a real interest in America, and as Chancellor, he matters to people looking for money for aid. Her relationship with Robin Cook at the Foreign Office was rather a prickly one, but she got on extremely well with Gordon Brown, who backed the aid program all along. And of course, Tony Blair's commitment to the Millennium Goals was real. Andrew Mitchell, in my view, was a good development minister, principally because David Cameron was committed to the Millennium Goals and to the 0.7 target. So it's not really the structures that decide this. It's the motivation and commitment of those right at the top. I have to admit that I would be less nervous about this if Rory Stewart were Foreign Secretary. But the key is number 10. I have no idea what the Prime Minister's real views on development aid are, and the Treasury. And of course, we're heading, I fear, for another period of austerity. Actually, my bigger worry about it is what it will do to one of the most important elements in our soft power at the moment. With our hard power falling, both absolutely and relatively. Soft power is more important, but the universities and the research area and the legal professions are all going to take a Brexit hit. And the reputation of this country for knowing how to run financial markets took a hit 10 years ago. And our reputation for good government is taking a hit because of the handling of the pandemic. If the perception got abroad that we were using the aid program as a sludge fund to assist trade promotion, defense sales, and so on, even if that was only true to a very limited extent, if that was the perception, then we would lose our place in the Premier Division on development aid. And we are very high in the Premier Division now. DfID is a remarkable professional operation, which has a very high standing globally and is a considerable element in our soft power credentials at the moment. So that's why I'm really worried, is that if the tone from the top is you can forget the Perga Dam. We can fiddle these things a bit. You can deal with that in part by having separate accounting officers. I hope they will have separate votes. As I hope they will have separate scrutiny in the House of Commons. And I totally agree with Sarah on that. You can do a bit, but you can't really deal with the problem if the tone from the top is wrong. So that's what's worrying me. I admit that these are fears about the future. I don't know what Mr. Johnson's views is. I don't know whether he is actually a strong supporter of aid, but I can't find anything in his past which provides grounds for believing that.
Okay, interesting. So, James, a couple of things there that I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on. Do you think this does sort of mark the beginning of a change in the government's aid strategy and potential implications for the budget? But also, I don't know, maybe it's too soon, but what has the reaction been in the countries that the Halo Trust works in to this news? Do people see it as a change in focus away from the Premier Division of aid that Lord Kerr mentioned?
Let me take your last point first. I mean, I don't think so, no. I mean, most of the Halo Trust is a multinational NGO. Our biggest donors are the United States. Other big donors are Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Japan, Canada. Many of these countries already do this. I mean, very enlightened countries such as the Netherlands already operate in this way. So I really don't think this has to be have the outcome you're suggesting. I come back to this point about inputs and outputs. What will matter is what the outputs look like. So for me, the three big opportunities of this are: the first is human rights. If there is to be some sort of standoff with China, then we in the West need to position ourselves as a bastion of liberal democracy. Can we present a front that supports human rights and the liberal Western way of life? Secondly, I think that conflict, its resolution and its prevention has been very sadly neglected within the DfID structure. So DfID only has one weapon control program. It's a very successful one. It's the Global Mine Action Program, but it's actually only £100 million over 3 years. So £33 million a year out of a 15 billion ODA budget as of last year. That's tiny, really. It does strike me that since war is a primary driver of poverty and of human suffering in the round, it really ought to be central. So our biggest operation is in Afghanistan. There, the Halo Trust drew money from both DfID and from the CSSF. And it was madness having these things separated in that way. I think there's an opportunity to bring those two things together and to make a success of it. A central pillar of the new ministry should be conflict, its prevention and its resolution. And thirdly, I think climate change and biodiversity. Again, because of the rightly humanitarian focus of DfID, it perhaps did not take a close enough look at climate. I think Rory Stewart began to take it that way, or at biodiversity. And I think that must be a central priority of the new ministry. So those three opportunities, I think, must be at the heart of the new ministry.
Thank you. So I think that's a good moment to move on to sort of perhaps more current events. Now, we've spoken about climate change, we've spoken about the pandemic, mentioned China a couple of times. I'd like to discuss all of those. Sarah, what impact do you think the pandemic is going to have on how the UK conducts development? What do you think the UK's priorities should be in supporting developing countries deal with the pandemic? And do you think the FCDO structure will help the UK government do that, or will it be a hindrance?
I mean, I'm hesitating because at this point in time, I don't know, because the impact that it's having on our economy, and therefore immediately the percentage of money that we'll be giving is pretty catastrophic at the moment, and you know that's going to have a very real and direct consequence. The impact that it is starting to have in the developing world is enormous. I mean, we're seeing what's going on in India. We're hearing reports about what's happening in, for example, Yemen and Syria. But of course, without the testing and the infrastructure, it's impossible to get the data to see exactly what the effect is. And also, for me, it's the knock-on effect that it's having with existing aid programmes, as the aid sector is trying to shore up to either deal with or prevent COVID impacting on their regions. They're understandably pausing other programmes. So we've already seen that measles is about to come back as a pandemic. I worry about tuberculosis. I worry about famine. You know, the consequences of all of these things is going to be quite staggering. And so it's hard for me to answer because it's very much a live thing. What I can say is, looking at positives, if FCDO is able to speak with one voice that is very focused, unify all of the resources the UK has to address these issues, then of course that can only be a good thing. And I do completely understand there are situations where there may well be either just a delay in communication between two departments, or a standoff on sort of moral issues of two departments, when actually the people on the ground just want help and they want it now. So I do get that. And I'm an optimist, and I would hope in a couple of years, once this is bedded in, we will be in a strong position. My fear is that we need that clear leadership now, and as Lord Kerr has said, already this merger is tying up some of the heads of both departments, which is taking them away from the work that we need them to be focused on right now. So I'm very, very concerned about the long-term impacts.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that distraction point always comes through in any of these kind of departmental changes. We've looked at this at the IFG, and it's often a sort of a 2-year plus journey until the new organisation, whatever it is, is really sort of up and running at full strength. And obviously there's in the lifetime of the government, 2 years, maybe not that long, but in the lifetime of, the next 2 years, there's a lot happening. So to return to your point, Lord Kerr, about the distraction, and, do you think the FCDO is going to be sort of, I don't know, firing on all cylinders, whatever the appropriate kind of analogy is for the next year? Because as well as dealing with the pandemic, the UK has the presidency of the G7 next year, and then at the end of next year, there's the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow. 2 big sort of set piece foreign policy events that the UK is in charge of. Is there a risk that the UK isn't able to fully focus on those because it's reorganising Whitehall?
No, not a huge risk. I think. I think we need to think very hard about COP26, and I'm not sure that the preparations are as advanced as they should be, and the international diplomacy that's involved. And I think it's a bit hard to ask Mr. Sharma to do it, given that he is trying to steer business through the virus and the Brexit complications at the end of the year. I am uneasy that the government is not giving sufficient attention to that. I think we can chew gum while walking. I think it's not impossible to do these things together. The sort of team that will be working on G7 and so on is not the same team that will be working on the merger. So I don't want to exaggerate the distraction point, but it will be a bumpy couple of years. I think that in the field, there will be only advantages from this. I mean, I've sounded very negative so far. I think that one should say that the aid program is likely to benefit from the better informed full-time attention of the head of mission, the High Commissioner or the ambassador in the field. I think that one fault of ODM DfID was that the ex-colony of the Foreign Office tended to behave like an ex-colony, and the Foreign Office always tended to behave like a disgruntled ex-colonial power. The DfID or ODM didn't like co-location, wanted their own office, wanted to be the ones who were going to negotiate with the finance ministry and so on. Actually, the finance ministry and the Prime Minister's office in the developing country didn't really understand this distinction between the diplomats and the aid office. And bringing the two together will actually be useful for both. The ambassador will be better able to do his job on behalf of the British development interest, and DfID will be better served if the local knowledge of the Foreign Office is better combined with the development expertise of the present DfID. So I would expect considerable benefits on the ground, though they don't outweigh my view that this is a very wrong time to take on a big distraction and my nervousness about the motivation for the whole thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, well, I think there's a lot of other context we could talk about, and I'm sure we'll come back around to it, but perhaps to pick up that practical point, I mean, James, from your point of view, do you have a sense of what the strengths of each department are that you think should be preserved in the FCDO, or are there things where they can learn from each other? You know, can the Foreign Office do things better by bringing in DfID skills and vice versa? Oh,
without a shadow of a doubt. And I mean, I think that what should be clear in all of this is that that unity of purpose needs to be present, what Lord Kerr's talking about. And I really want to see heads of mission empowered to be in charge of what is going on inside their own embassy. And too often I've seen it where an ambassador says, oh, well, that's DfID, nothing to do with me. And that can't be right. And indeed, it will help them as they go to talk to the ministerial contacts in whichever the country they're at, if they have that power and the checkbook that comes with it. Because sometimes I think ambassadors or indeed visiting Foreign Office ministers are not given the respect they are due because they don't have the checkbook with them. Now they will have that. So I think that's really important. I would also say at a departmental level, the sooner a chief operating officer, call him or her that, is appointed, the better, i.e. a minister of state of true power who does not have necessarily cabinet rights to sit and attend, but is truly empowered to deliver on this, leaving the Foreign Secretary to get on with his day job. Because I think unless that sort of second in command figure, chief operating officer, is appointed, bringing this together is going to be really difficult. And the third thing is I wouldn't try for too much change too soon. I would go for, and I think this is what they are doing, going for a good enough in September, and then let the really profound changes happen really quite slowly thereafter, so that we don't have the distractions which are, they're true risks. They're not to be underplayed, but they mustn't be allowed to distract us in the coming period. Great, thank you. Sarah, I'd like to talk about scrutiny. I know you're sort of obviously, very interested in how the new department is scrutinised. What is your view on how Parliament can best scrutinise it? Obviously, there's I think a question about what happens to your committee. I'm not sure sort of what the latest is on that, but so what are you hoping for?
Well, we're haggling at the moment to change the remit of IDC, the International Development Committee, to become the ODA Scrutiny Committee. There has always been an ODA Scrutiny Committee in some form or a subcommittee since 1969. It was only when the department was created, that we focused just on departmental stuff. The money is the key thing for me, where it's spent, how it's spent, and the value for money that it gets for the taxpayer. And for a long time, DfID has been the main sort of benefactor of the ODA spend, but that's gently been spent in different departments. So I think DfID now has 73% of the spend, and the rest is across departments like the FCDO, Defence, Home Office, Education, Biz. So for me, it's scrutinising where that money is going, making sure that it is for the purpose that it is defined in statute, and just keeping that focus on the alleviation of poverty, making sure we don't go back to, as Lord Kerr said, a whiff of sort of tide aid, or sort of using the money for sort of greasing the wheels, because that will have such long-term damage to our international standing, that even if it is happening by accident, we need to stop that. And my concern is that whenever we have the international audit of where that ODA spend is going, DfID always comes up in the top 10. It's not perfect, it's far from it, but it comes in the top 10, whereas departments like the FCO tend to come a lot lower down, and their focus is much, much more on the middle income countries, whereas DfID development is on the poorest countries, and that's where in statute it ought to be focused on. To link to a point that James was saying, and I agree with all the points he made, one of my sort of concerns is the government is looking at was proposed that the IDC becomes a subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee. The reality of that is just capacity. It's already a very, very busy department, and £15 billion scrutinising that actually takes a lot of energy. It would immediately, for the FCO, their spend, their budget is going up by 400%. Yeah. So to try and scrutinise that on top of everything else is going to be really difficult unless you have a dedicated committee. And to sort of, I get James's points entirely about having one voice in country and the simplification of that. But also the reality is, because the ambassadors haven't had that spend, that checkbook, there really very quickly needs to be someone in country as well as in government who is looking at that spend, who knows about procurement and tendering, managing projects, getting value for money, and just accounting for that. And that person or people need to be in place really quickly. So we have got the transparency from the 1st of September. Because my concern is, in the rush to keep projects going, particularly ongoing projects, that accountability gets lost in the mix, and that could have some very catastrophic long-term effects.
Absolutely. And what about James's suggestion of this kind of chief operating officer minister figure? Do you think there should be a sort of, a second in command minister in the new department who is the aid person?
I think that's a very, very sensible suggestion. It's to keep that focus on, to keep the voice at the table saying, yes, but what if? I'm thinking, I as soon as the merger was announced, I was taken off the Committee on Arms Export Controls, a committee made up of sort of 3 departments: international trade, international development and defence. That worries me, because there may well be a situation where, from the trade and defence point of view, you're arguing to sell arms to X country, without the development voice to say, actually, do you know the people running that are terrorising their own people, are using the weapons on their own people? Should we really be selling to them? It's those sort of things that concern me, that little what if voice, or how about if we do it this way voice, if it's not there at the top table, the unintended consequences of that could be, quite concerning, I'd say.
Absolutely, absolutely. Lord Kerr, others have mentioned some of the kind of things that should be brought out in this merger, some of the skills that should be preserved, some of the practical steps. What do you think? You were head of the Foreign Office in '97 when DfID was created. What do you think can be learned from that demerger as it's reversed 20 however many years later?
First, I totally agree with James that the chief operating officer idea is correct. I'm sure there needs to be a very senior Minister of State, which I think it would be good to have in the cabinet. We frequently had two Foreign Office ministers in the cabinet. Usually the remit of the second one was Europe. Well, we can think about that does create a vacant chair, which could be filled by the minister in from DfID who is responsible particularly for development. And I do think ring fencing is really important. Integrating budgets would be a very bad idea. I'm with Sarah on the need to have proper scrutiny by the House of Commons. House of Lords are hopeless on this because we don't really have financial responsibility. Public Accounts Committee in the House of Commons is, of course, very important, but it's retrospective. The Public Accounts Committee can't prevent a scandal; it can merely prevent the next scandal by exploring why a scandal happened. So I think that the day-to-day scrutiny by a committee whose sole remit is the aid program, 15 million, it deserves it. I think that's essential. I should say that I should have said before that James is absolutely right about conflict prevention, and there is no doubt that war is a major contributor to destitution, poverty, migration, and the conflict prevention. There could be more spent on that, and that can be perfectly reasonably classified as development. So I think that's correct. But I think it is important to have in the Foreign Office a Rory Stewart figure as the senior Minister of State, ideally with a seat in the cabinet.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn to some of the questions we've had in from interested members of the public, various sort of parliamentarians, all sorts of people have got in touch, but we might cycle around to some of these issues again. So first up, Baroness Rawlings got in touch to ask, she said, aid donations were always calculated by the number of people below the poverty line, which is why we were always giving money to China and India, which she says is a crazy way of calculating. Will this policy be reviewed? Do you think this is an opportunity to think about how the UK does aid differently? Sarah, I'm going to pitch that in your direction if you don't mind.
I mean, it makes me nervous, this, because there is wiggle room within the existing definition, and that is sort of the in the national interest angle. I would argue that we need to maintain that focus on alleviating poverty. Yes, we ought to be doing that by developing the countries, but it ought to be for the right reasons and the morally right reasons, rather than just for the benefit of the UK. I think that by doing the right thing long term, we actually benefit as a country better. I've seen where, we've supported young people with their education, higher education particularly, and then when they go back to their country, they get, great offices and set up great businesses and want to work with the UK because they've seen us as a country that does the right thing and they want to repay the support that we've given to them. I become nervous when we start tampering with definitions in the national interest, if the national interest is the overriding reason for doing it. So I personally, I think the focus should always be on the lowest income countries. where there has been reviews of spend, and it's been not by DfID department, but by other departments on middle income countries. That's where we sort of get into the grey areas, and they're the examples that tend to turn up in the Daily Mail. You know, why on earth are we paying for cinemas in India, for example? I think the British public by nature are humanitarians and charitable, and they want to alleviate poverty. They're less keen on supporting countries that have, you know, a very sizable middle class, make more money, to be blunt about it.
Yeah, so it'd be interesting to see if that focus can be sort of transplanted and secured in the new department, because as you say, I think a lot of the criticism of those kind of projects is often actually levied at the Foreign Office. Exactly. And other departments that spend the aid budget rather than DfID. James, there are a couple of questions about the Sustainable Development Goals, which I might pitch in your direction. Tell me if you don't think these are relevant. But Ken Bluestone, who works at Age International, has asked, leave no one behind is a public commitment the government has made to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. And so what leadership structures and systems are necessary to make the SDGs a priority within the new department? And then Richard Pyle asked a similar question, saying, are the SDGs still the driving force for the UK's international development agenda? And how can the government ensure they remain at the centre of policy making within the new department? Yeah,
I think this leads on very nicely from what Sarah was just saying. For me, this business about national interest is the difference really between realpolitik and what I would hope is good old-fashioned statecraft. What I think we're witnessing with China is through its Belt and Roads Initiative, naked realpolitik. It's using economic power with a slight fig leaf of trying to improve people's lives, but actually there's an absolute selfish interest at the heart of it. I think the way we use our aid, and I do believe the Sustainable Development Goals are an excellent peg against which we can judge our performance, means that we are viewed in a much better way than that nakedly selfish approach. And I think we should absolutely stick to them. Now, if you ask me, will we? I have no idea. I'm not a member of the government. But should we? I think we should. Great.
Nice and succinct. Thank you very much. Lord Kerr, if I could turn to you with a question from Paul Beaver, who has said, can you ask the panel what benefits they can see for international trade, the prosperity agenda and global Britain from the departmental merger? So we've talked a little bit about defence and security, but what about on the trade and prosperity side? Do we think the FCDO will be better placed to I guess, capitalise on that? And obviously, as you mentioned, you know, we're leaving the transition period at the end of the year. Will the FCDO help the UK get the trade deals that the government is hoping for?
I don't think there's much benefit in this here. I would myself have favoured the merger of the FCO and the export promotion rifle, which very nearly took place under Tony Blair, but unfortunately Peter Mandelson came back from Brussels and was successfully saw off the efforts made by people like me to take trade promotion into the Foreign Office. I would have preferred that now than a merger with development. Trade promotion clearly fits very well with the Foreign Office's remit, which is to pursue British interests worldwide. Of course, I accept that British interests on any sane definition include the reduction in world poverty, because no man is an island, and we see the migration flows which cause concern in this country as a result of lack of development. But I don't really think that there is much of an upside for Union Jack promotion across the world, global business agenda from this merger, and I think it's a pity that we're not having the other merger that I would have preferred. I do think that the global Britain rhetoric, we need to be quite careful about it at a time when we are caused a good deal of puzzlement across the world by what we're doing to ourselves with Brexit, and we are clearly going to go through a rather sticky batch, whether or not there is an agreement this autumn with the European Union. So I think we need the flag waving, where world beating rhetoric, I think, needs to be reined in a little bit.
Thank you. Sarah, if I can pick up that just quickly, because we've mentioned Brexit, the UK does work quite closely with the EU on development, sort of much more closely than it does on foreign policy and around. Obviously, you know, we're still some way from seeing the shape of the agreement with the EU, but do you think the end of the transition period in December of this year will affect how the UK works with Brussels on development? And do you, again, you know, is the FCDO, is that an opportunity to do more with Brussels or take back control more on development from Brussels, to use that phrase?
Yeah, don't bait me with slogans, please. What I would say is this is something which I don't know why people aren't talking about, because a lot of our ODA spend goes to EU, and that there are strengths and weaknesses with sort of multilateral partnerships, but I haven't heard any conversations about whether or not that money is going to continue, or if we're looking to do, I don't know, bilateral or give more to the UN or World Bank, or I don't know. And that's exactly the reason why I think we need to have that developmental voice, either at cabinet or definitely at senior minister level, because it seems to be being forgotten. I mean, I'm sure it's not, it's just not being talked about. But I'd also like to say a little bit about the whole Global Britain, because while Lord Kerr was talking, I was remembering the Call Britannia slogan. And I loved it. and I do think that there is very much something about having a unified message going forwards, and that takes clear leadership in government, whether that's from the Prime Minister or across the cabinet. But I don't think that means that you can't have lots of different departments all singing from that same hymn sheet. It's just that someone needs to be writing the hymn and handing it out. And I don't think that just doing a merger gets you to that position. We need to have someone who has got that vision, that is bringing everybody together, and that is actively promoting that internationally. So that's what I want to be seeing now. And if by the end of August, when this merger is meant to be completed, which of course it can't possibly be completed, but I think if the government was coming out with that clear vision that the rest of us could rally behind at all levels, that would help us with, you know, trade, international standing, leverage. So I think that will be the one thing that I'd be asking for over the summer recess.
Great. And presumably, I mean, you know, we know the government is conducting this integrated review, which as mentioned was paused because of the pandemic. But presumably the hope is that integrated review provides that strategy, provides that hymn sheet, and then that sort of sets, you know, the priorities for the FCDO, but also the Ministry of Defence, the Department of International Trade, and all the rest of the bits of the UK government that operate internationally. Are you optimistic for the IR? Do you think it will deliver that? Or
well, I just hope that the review doesn't say do not merge DfID with the Foreign Office, because that would be disastrous. I mean, that's what I don't need to agree with it, but I like to see the evidence for decisions being made, and that's why, you know, we want a parliamentary voice, we want the parliamentary scrutiny, so that we can actually help and hold the government to account and drive it sort of in the right direction. So yes, that would be what I would hope would come out of it. The problem with that is with the timetable that they were talking about, sort of end of autumn into winter. So to be quite honest, that's too late. We need it now. Yeah.
James, what are your thoughts on the integrated review? Are you hopeful for what it means for HMG abroad?
Well, absolutely. I am hopeful for it. I think if one is cynical, the Global Britain slogan is a slogan in search of a strategy. And there's a lot of flesh to be put on the bones of it to make it meaningful. And I hope I've sort of indicated 3 areas in the form of conflict, climate and human rights that might form the basis for that. I'm sure there are other things as well. But I'd just like to touch on a couple of other points made. First of all, on Europe. You know, I know my own organisation's finances well, obviously. We are funded, our Syrian programme is funded by the European Union's ECHO programme. Now, from January, we won't be eligible for that money anymore because we won't be an EU entity. We've actually registered in Europe, but we haven't been there long enough. We have to have several years of auditable accounts, and therefore we can't be eligible until 2024. I hope that, first of all, that the deal will overcome that and that there will be a deal. Secondly, if there isn't a deal, the repatriated money, there is a substitution programme by which money that was formerly sent to Europe by the UK is then spent on substituting for any lost money in the European Union. Thirdly, I think it is restricted practice by the EU to exclude foreign NGOs from its work. It's not something the Americans would do, it's not something the British would do, it's very peculiar behaviour, and I think it should be stopped. I am concerned by the division between bilateral expenditure from DfID to UK NGOs and multilateral expenditure. A huge amount of the DfID spend is spent through multilateral instruments. And I think sometimes that is absolutely logical. For instance, the recent Gavi announcement is fantastic, and full marks to Anne-Marie Trevelyan for that. But a lot of money is very curious. So, for instance, we're the beneficiary of the DfID Global Mine Action Programme. 54% of it is spent through the UN. Why? I mean, there's no need for it. All that happens is a vast amount of very expensive bureaucracy. That money should be repatriated, in my opinion, and spent through bilateral instruments with NGOs directly. And the British taxpayer would get a much, much better return on their investment, especially in these straitened times. So I hope that gives some sort of reflections on the last few comments.
Definitely, thank you. Really appreciate it. I'm going to take one more of the questions we've had in, and then I'll turn to sort of some concluding thoughts. But I think this one is for you, Lord Kerr. David Natzler gets in touch to ask, should all permanent staff of the new office be able to compete for vacancies as they arise, regardless of their department of origin?
I'm not close enough to know what the two permanent secretaries had in mind. I think the nationality point is a serious one. I think it would be quite difficult for the Foreign Office to agree that people working on defence, security, intelligence in the Foreign Office, or people handling the product of intelligence agencies in the Foreign Office could be non-UK nationals. And DfID has a remarkable multinational staff with real expertise in development economics. So I'm not criticising DfID for not being UK national only, but I do think this is a quite serious problem. I think on the ground in posts, it's not really a problem. I would hope that DfID staff would be able to compete for posts abroad, not just on development, but on economic work more generally and so on. I don't really see the problem abroad. The problem at home, I think, is quite a big one. I remember a similar demerger problem about the handling of intelligence in 1997, 98, which was successfully solved. But these things do take a very long time, and now is rather a bad time to be tackling them with the virus, with Brexit, with everything else going on. So I'm sorry it's happening. But I'm sure that people will contrive to make a success of it, and it will be very important that nobody on the present staff of either department should see their prospects diminished by the merger. There should be increased prospects for some and no diminution for anybody.
Great, thank you. And actually, just one more quick question for you, Lord Kerr, if you don't mind. So you mentioned how Sir Simon MacDonald, the permanent secretary of the Foreign Office, is leaving before the new department comes into existence. What would your advice to his or her successor be on taking that role?
Oh dear, it would be presumptuous. It's a very long time since I was in that office. I think probably my message would be that this isn't a takeover. Nor is it even a merger. It's the creation of something completely new, in which development will have a high and protected status in strategic aims. I think everybody in both departments are going to be affected. Nobody in the Foreign Office should go around behaving like the colonial power again, saying we've got them back. I'm sure nobody is planning to do that, but it will have to be seen as the creation of something new, merging the best qualities of both, and absolutely not taken.
Great, thank you. So that is a nice segue into my closing question. So just in the last few minutes, I would like to ask you all, in 5 years' time, looking back, what will you need to see happen to be able to say that this was the right decision, and that the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office was a success? James, can I turn to you first?
I return to my first point. Look at the outputs. Where will the world be in 5 years' time? Are we going to be accommodating or competing with China? What are the second order issues of the world? A great swathe of the Middle East, of Africa, of Asia is in conflict. Will those countries still be as fragile and conflict affected as they are at the moment? Can we make a difference there? What will be our relationship with Europe? How will we interact with a diminished America in this new world? These things are incredibly important, and they far outweigh, to my mind, the rearranging of the deck chairs in Whitehall. We must focus on these things as the absolute priority.
Great, thank you. Lord Kerr, what would you need to see?
The question 5 years' time is, will we still be seen as being in the Premier Division? I agree with James that conflict prevention, climate change, and human rights, these should be right at the top of the agenda, but they are all aspects of development, linked to development. Is the British government still, in 5 years' time, investing 0.7% or more of GNI in development? Is it delivering on the Millennium Goals? Did it run a successful COP26? Did it put its money where its mouth is? Did it take the necessary domestic measures to reflect its its legislative commitment to a no carbon economy? At present, we have very good on the talk. We've written the commitment into law, but we haven't done much of the walk yet. So I would say that if we are to remain in the Premier League, we will, despite the difficulties that we're going to face in the next 2 or 3 years because of the pandemic and Brexit and the recession that the pandemic produces, which will be exacerbated by Brexit. Despite that, did we stick to what we said were our aims? And did the structures in Whitehall reflect our sticking to that?
Great, thank you. And Sarah, how would you judge success?
Success for me would be that we're recognised internationally as a country that takes our moral responsibility on the world stage seriously and delivers on that, and acts swiftly and appropriately to threats, both to our own country but also to those that are less vulnerable to us, and works in a collaborative way to resolve them. I'd also really like us to be in a position that the British public is very proud of our international work, that has good parliamentary scrutiny so that we can show transparency and value for money, and that as a country we just feel that morally we're on the right page.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. I thought that was a fascinating discussion. A lot of questions still to come. And as we've said, the FCDO officially comes into being in September, but we know that there'll be a lot more work as it really gets up and running. So at the IFG, we'll continue to follow this topic closely. Thank you to our panelists. Really appreciate your time. And thank you to everyone who sent in their questions. I apologise if we weren't able to answer or discuss your question. Please do follow the IFG, check out our other events and podcasts. You can get everything on our website. So I'm going to close there. Thank you once again to everyone for joining me.